Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to listen closely because this isn't just a story about someone who treated you badly. This is the story of what happens when a person realizes they've lost something real, something rare, something they could never replace. You know the kind of love I'm talking about, the kind that was honest, deep, and steady until it was met with manipulation, disrespect, and silence. And now you're left wondering if they ever knew what they had. Tonight, I'm going to tell you the truth they already know and the peace you deserve. The silent regret is one of the most misunderstood aspects of dealing with a narcissist, because people expect regret to look like accountability, apologies, or emotional ownership. With a narcissist, it rarely does. Their regret lives in a quiet internal space where pride and shame collide, and it shows up not as remorse for the pain they caused, but as discomfort over what they lost. When control slips through their fingers, something in them destabilizes. They replay moments, not because they miss you in a healthy way, but because your absence exposes a gap they can't easily fill. Narcissists are deeply invested in maintaining an image of power and superiority. When you were present, especially if you were empathetic, loyal, or emotionally available, you helped reinforce that image. You reflected back to them a version of themselves they wanted to believe in. When they treated you badly, they assumed you would adapt, endure, and stay. That assumption is what fuels their silent regret. They didn't expect consequences that couldn't be manipulated. This regret isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with messages or confessions. Instead, it appears in subtle ways: sudden curiosity about your life, an inability to fully commit to replacements, irritation when your name is mentioned, or restlessness they can't explain. They feel the loss of influence more than the loss of connection, and that realization bruises their ego in ways they don't know how to process. What makes this regret powerful is that it's unresolvable for them. They can't fix it without admitting fault, and admitting fault threatens the identity they protect at all costs. So they live with it quietly, often pretending indifference while internally aware that they mishandled something valuable. The silence isn't absence of feeling, it's containment. And that is why their regret never brings closure. Only tension they carry forward long after you've begun to heal. And here's where that silent regret deepens. Because once they feel the loss, the mind looks for an escape. Narcissists are experts at avoiding responsibility, but even they cannot escape one truth: mistreatment is never accidental. What happened to you wasn't a misunderstanding, a communication issue, or bad timing. It was a choice made over and over again. A choice to dismiss your feelings, to cross boundaries they knew existed, to take more than they gave because they believed they could. They recognized your patience long before you recognized their pattern. They tested limits deliberately, watching how much you would tolerate, how often you would forgive, how deeply you would bend to keep the connection alive. Each time you stayed, it reinforced their belief that consequences were optional, not because they didn't understand right from wrong, but because entitlement whispered that they were exempt from it. This is what makes the regret sharper. When you finally step away, they can no longer tell themselves they didn't know. They knew exactly when they ignored your pain. They knew when they minimized your hurt. They knew when they chose control over care. And once you're gone, that awareness has nowhere to hide. The story they told themselves begins to crack, and the weight of those decisions settles in. For you, understanding this is liberating. It untangles you from the lie that if you had loved better, spoken differently, or tried harder, the outcome would have changed. It wouldn't have, because you were responding with sincerity to someone who was operating from strategy. You were showing up with honesty while they were making calculations. And that's the quiet power shift. Their regret grows not because they miss the chaos, but because they recognize, even if only privately, that they consciously chose actions that cost them someone who cared. You didn't walk away because you were weak or dramatic. You walked away because you finally honored the truth they spent so long ignoring. And once that truth settles in them, another realization follows, one they fight against but can't fully escape. The problem was never your worth. It was never that you were too sensitive, too demanding, too emotional, or too much. That story was convenient because it shifted the spotlight away from their behavior and onto your humanity. But deep down, they knew better. They always did. They didn't treat you badly because you were lacking. They treated you badly because you carried something they didn't possess: emotional depth, empathy, consistency, the ability to love without keeping score. Your presence quietly highlighted what they were missing inside themselves. And instead of being inspired by that, they felt threatened by it. When someone lives on control, genuine connection feels dangerous. That's why they tried to shrink you, why your confidence unsettled them, why your intuition irritated them, why your questions felt like attacks. You weren't asking for too much, you were asking for truth, safety, and reciprocity. And those requests exposed the gap between who they pretended to be and who they actually were. Rather than face that gap, they tried to convince you that you were the problem. This is where their awareness becomes uncomfortable. When you leave and begin to heal, the narrative collapses. If you were truly the issue, you would be the one broken, stuck, or chasing closure. But instead, you grow quieter, steadier, more grounded. And that contrast speaks louder than any argument ever could. They see it. They may never admit it, but they see that your value didn't disappear when you walked away. It expanded. Your absence doesn't create relief for them, it creates exposure. Exposure to the truth that they mishandled someone rare. Not because you were unlovable, but because you were powerful in ways they couldn't control. And that understanding lingers. Because nothing unsettles a narcissist more than realizing the person they tried to diminish is thriving without them, carrying forward a strength that was always there, waiting to be chosen. A.N.D. That's when the absence truly begins to echo. Because once they recognize your value wasn't the problem, they start to feel the weight of what they actually lost. It isn't just a person who walked away, it's the steady stream of emotional energy you provided without even realizing it. Your reassurance, your understanding, your ability to smooth over conflict, to believe in them when they faltered. That was nourishment to them. And when that supply disappears, something inside them starts to unravel. They search for replacements, but it's never the same. They may find attention, admiration, even infatuation, but they struggle to find the depth you offered so naturally. What you gave wasn't surface level validation, it was emotional investment. You showed up with care, with presence, with a willingness to see them fully. Losing that destabilizes them because it forces them to sit with themselves in ways they've always avoided. This is where their behavior often becomes erratic, not because they're heartbroken in the way you were, but because the familiar source of regulation is gone. You helped absorb their emotional chaos. You translated their moods. You carried weight that was never yours to hold. Without you, they're left facing their own restlessness, insecurity, and emptiness, and they don't know what to do with it. And here's the part that matters for you. Their discomfort is not proof that you should return. It's proof that your presence mattered. Your energy mattered. You weren't imagining the imbalance. You were living inside it. When you withdrew, the system they relied on collapsed. They feel this loss even if they can't name it. It shows in the way they out indirectly, the way they monitor from a distance, the way they compare everyone else to you without ever saying your name. Your absence forces a reckoning they never planned for. While they scramble to replace what they drained, you begin to reclaim what you gave away. And that's the quiet irony. They lose stability just as you begin to find it. The supply they took for granted becomes the very thing they can't seem to replicate, and they know, somewhere deep down, that they were careless with something they can never fully get back. And while they are busy trying to replace what they lost, something far more important is happening on your side of the story. Your healing begins, slowly at first, almost awkwardly, because you're so used to carrying someone else's emotional weight that carrying your own feels unfamiliar. But with each day of distance, clarity grows. You start to breathe differently. You start to notice how much energy you were spending just to keep the peace. And without intending to, you become living proof of the consequence they never anticipated. Your growth is not loud or performative. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in the way you no longer react the same, the way your nervous system begins to settle, the way joy feels lighter and less conditional. This is what they can't control. They could manipulate conversations, twist narratives, and provoke emotional responses, but they cannot manipulate healing. And that is where the balance tips permanently. They see it in fragments, in the calm you carry, in the way you no longer seek validation, in the absence of chaos where they expected desperation. Your healing reflects back to them what their behavior costs, not in words, but in contrast. You are becoming more whole, and that wholeness highlights how fractured the dynamic truly was. This is the consequence they never planned for. They expected you to break, to chase, to stay emotionally tethered. Instead, you rebuild. And every step you take toward yourself is a step further from their reach. Your peace becomes the boundary they cannot cross. What's powerful is that you don't heal to prove anything. You heal because your nervous system demands safety, because your heart deserves rest, because love was never meant to feel like survival. And in choosing that, you create a result they can't undo. They may move on, deflect, or pretend indifference, but your healing stands as a quiet truth they have to live with. You become the consequence without saying a word, not through punishment, but through progress. And that is the kind of outcome that lingers because it reminds them that what they lost wasn't just you, it was the chance to grow alongside someone who chose themselves. And somewhere along that healing path, a moment arrives that changes everything. It's not dramatic. There's no confrontation, no final argument, no perfect closing statement. It's simply the moment you see clearly. The fog lifts. The confusion that kept you second guessing yourself begins to dissolve, and suddenly the patterns make sense. That awareness becomes the breaking point, not for you, but for them. Because control only works in the dark as long as you were questioning yourself, explaining your feelings, and hoping they would finally understand. The dynamic stayed intact. But the moment you stopped internalizing their behavior, and started recognizing it for what it was, their influence weakened. You no longer needed them to validate your reality. You trusted your perception, and that shift is devastating to someone who survives on distortion. They feel it immediately. Conversations don't land the same. Emotional hooks stop working. Guilt trips fall flat. You respond with calm instead of confusion, distance instead of defensiveness. To you, it feels like peace. To them, it feels like losing ground. This awareness exposes the imbalance they worked so hard to maintain. You're no longer asking why they hurt you. You understand that hurting you served them. And with that understanding comes detachment. Not bitterness, not anger, just clarity. And clarity is the one thing they can't manipulate. They know something has changed because the familiar levers no longer move you. Your silence isn't compliance anymore, it's closure. Your boundaries aren't threats, they're facts. You've stepped out of the role they assigned you, and without your participation, the script collapses. This is where their anxiety grows. They can sense that the version of you who tried to save the connection is gone. In its place is someone who sees the full picture and chooses differently. Awareness turns your healing into a line they can't cross. Once you see clearly, you can't unsee it. And they know that. They know the spell is broken. And that knowledge settles in as an unspoken loss because they understand, even if they never admit it, that they no longer have access to the version of you they once controlled. And when that spell breaks, reality rushes in fast because awareness doesn't just remove confusion, it exposes miscalculation. At some point, they realized they pushed too far. Not emotionally, but strategically, they overestimated how much you would endure and underestimated the moment you would wake up. Control depends on balance, and they disrupted it with their own behavior. They replay moments then, the times you went quiet, the times you looked tired instead of reactive, the times you stopped fighting to be understood. Those weren't signs of weakness. Those were warning signs. But narcissists often mistake patience for permanence, loyalty for obligation. They believe they can keep taking without consequence until suddenly the ground gives way beneath them. This is when they understand they overplayed their hand. You were supposed to stay uncertain. You were supposed to doubt yourself. You were supposed to keep trying. Instead, you stepped back and saw the pattern clearly. And once you did, every move they made afterward felt too late, too obvious, too forced. Apologies lacked depth. Affection felt transactional. The shift was irreversible. What unsettles them most is not just that you left, but that you left without chaos. You didn't explode. You didn't beg. You didn't destroy the narrative. You simply disengaged. And that quiet exit is what confirms their mistake. If you had still been reactive, they could have believed they still had leverage, but your calm told the truth. They had lost it. They know they misjudged you. They thought your empathy meant endless tolerance. They thought your love meant self-abandonment. They thought wrong. And now they're left with the awareness that their own behavior created the very outcome they feared. This realization sits heavy because It can't be blamed on anyone else. No outside interference, no misunderstanding, just a series of choices that led to the loss of someone who no longer plays the game. They see it now. They pushed too hard, took too much, and revealed too clearly who they were. And once that happens, there's no undoing it. Because when someone finally chooses clarity over chaos, the power they once handed over is never available again. And after that realization settles in, something unexpected happens. You stop speaking. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you finally understand that words were never the currency of change. You've said everything already. You explained, clarified, pleaded, and reasoned. Silence this time isn't confusion, it's completion. And that silence lands heavier than any argument ever could. They feel it immediately. The absence of reaction unsettles them more than confrontation ever did. There's no emotion to redirect, no energy to provoke, no narrative to twist in real time. Your quiet becomes a mirror, reflecting their behavior back to them without commentary. And in that stillness, they are forced to sit with themselves. Silence dismantles the illusion of control. As long as you were responding, even defensively, the connection stayed alive. Every explanation was an invitation. Every emotional reaction was proof of access. But when you step back and say nothing, the door closes without a sound. That's when they realize the dynamic has shifted beyond repair. They may try to break that silence indirectly, a message disguised as concern, a memory resurfaced accidentally, a subtle reminder of the bond they believe still exists. But silence isn't punishment, it's protection. You're no longer trying to be understood by someone who benefited from misunderstanding you. And this is why silence speaks so loudly. It communicates finality without cruelty. It says, I see clearly now, and I'm choosing myself, without needing to justify or defend that choice. To them, it feels like being erased from a role they thought was permanent. Your quiet tells the truth they can't argue with. That access to you was a privilege, not a guarantee. That connection requires care, not control. And once silence replaces engagement, they know something has ended that can't be resurrected through manipulation. You didn't disappear to hurt them. You became still to heal yourself. But in doing so, you delivered the clearest message of all. You are no longer available for a story that only cost you pieces of yourself. And that understanding lands deeply in the space where their control used to live. And in that quiet, something else becomes undeniable. As they sit with the absence you left behind, comparison begins. Not the kind spoken out loud, but the kind that creeps in during moments of reflection they can't escape. They measure new connections against the depth you offered, and the difference becomes impossible to ignore. That's when the realization sharpens. You weren't replaceable. You were an upgrade they mishandled. What you brought into their life wasn't common. It wasn't loud or flashy, but it was rare. You brought consistency where they thrived on chaos. You brought emotional intelligence where they relied on control. You brought genuine presence into a dynamic built on performance. And now, without you, the contrast is clear. Surface level attention may come easily, but depth requires capacity, and that's where the gap shows. They may find people who admire them, but admiration isn't intimacy. They may find people who comply, but compliance isn't connection. What you offered required vulnerability, reciprocity, and growth. And by treating you badly, they showed they couldn't sustain the level you naturally lived at. This is where the regret stings differently. It's no longer just about losing supply or control. It's about losing someone who elevated the space they entered, someone who loved with intention, someone who saw potential and believed in it. That kind of presence doesn't cycle through lives easily. When it's gone, it leaves a quiet emptiness that no amount of distraction fills. And for you, this realization shifts something important. You stop wondering if you were too much and start understanding that you were simply too real for someone committed to illusion. You were offering growth to someone invested in comfort. That mismatch was never your failure. They know they won't find you again in the same way, not because you're perfect, but because you were genuine. And authenticity leaves a signature. When it's gone, the absence speaks louder than praise ever did. You were the upgrade, not something to be managed, diminished, or taken for granted. And the fact that they couldn't see that in time is the cost they carry forward long after you've moved on into spaces that recognize your value without needing to be convinced. And when that truth fully settles in, everything circles back to where it always was meant to end, with you. Because after the silence, after the comparisons, After the realization that they mishandled someone rare, what remains is not revenge, not validation, not even regret. What remains is your peace. And that is the final truth they cannot argue with, rewrite, or take from you. Peace changes the energy of everything. It shows in the way you no longer flinch at reminders, in the way their name no longer tightens your chest, in the way your life begins to feel spacious again. This is the outcome they never predicted, because peace doesn't feed ego, doesn't respond to manipulation, doesn't reopen doors that were closed with intention. They can sense it. They know when someone has truly moved on, not emotionally detached, but emotionally grounded. Your peace confirms that the chapter is closed not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. And that realization lands heavier than anger ever could. Anger keeps a connection alive. Peace ends it. You don't need them to acknowledge what they did. You don't need them to feel guilty or remorseful. Your life becomes the answer. A calmer nervous system, stronger boundaries, healthier love, joy that doesn't come with conditions. This is what they lose access to forever. And here's the quiet power in that: you don't win by proving them wrong. You win by no longer needing to prove anything at all. Your peace is the evidence. It's the full stop at the end of a sentence they thought they could keep rewriting. So if you ever wonder how the story truly ends, this is it. Not with confrontation, not with closure conversations, but with you walking forward, lighter, clearer, and whole. They know they messed up, but by the time they fully understand it, you're already somewhere else, living a little Ife that no longer revolves around their awareness. And that is the most powerful ending of all. And that peace is not just an ending, it's a beginning. Because when you choose peace, you also choose to stop carrying the weight of their story. You stop making their behavior your lesson, your trauma your identity, or their approval your validation. You stop giving them the power to define what you deserve. And that, more than anything, is the final consequence they cannot control. Your peace is the victory they never anticipated. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's real. It's the kind of victory that doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't need to be recorded or reposted or explained. It simply exists in the way you live your life now, with boundaries that protect your heart, with relationships that honor your worth, with a sense of self that doesn't require someone else's permission. You were not meant to be a cautionary tale for someone else's ego. You were meant to be a person who learned, grew, and chose themselves. And that choice is the most powerful lesson of all, that love is not supposed to hurt and strength is not supposed to be quiet. You don't heal to punish them. You heal to reclaim your life. You heal to remind yourself that you are not disposable and you are not a problem to be managed. You heal because your soul is tired of being compromised for someone else's comfort. And when you do, you become proof that growth is the one outcome they can't manipulate. That's why your peace matters so much, because it changes the story from what happened to me into what I became. It turns the pain into wisdom. It turns the loss into freedom. It turns the chaos into calm. And the most powerful part, their awareness of what they lost doesn't pull you back. It doesn't reopen doors. It doesn't rewrite your future. It simply confirms what you already knew, that you were worth more than the way they treated you. So let them carry their regret. Let them carry their awareness. Let them carry the knowledge that they mishandled something precious. You carry your peace. And in the quiet strength of that peace, you become the truest proof that the only person who ever had the power to save you was you. And you finally did. So here's the thing. When you walk away from someone who treated you badly, it doesn't mean you're giving up. It means you finally decided you're worth more than the pain you were asked to accept. And that decision is not a quiet one. It echoes. It changes you. It changes your future. It changes the kind of love you will accept from this moment on. If you've ever been in that place where you loved hard, tried to understand, and still got hurt, you know how heavy it feels. You know the confusion, the self-doubt, the desperate hope that if you just loved them enough, they'd finally see you. But the truth is, love is not a tool for manipulation. Love is not a test you pass by sacrificing your worth. And when someone consistently treats you badly, it isn't because you were too much. It's because they were not capable of meeting you with the respect you deserved. And the most powerful part of this whole story isn't that they realized they messed up. It's that you realized your own strength. You learned that peace is the most powerful answer. You learned that silence can be the clearest message. You learned that healing is not a reward for suffering, it's a right. So if you're watching this and you're still holding on to someone who doesn't deserve you, I want you to remember this. They may know they messed up, but that knowledge doesn't bring you back. It only proves what you already knew. You were worth more than the way they treated you. And when you finally step into your peace, you don't just survive the story, you rewrite it. You become the person who no longer tolerates disrespect, who no longer sacrifices themselves for someone else's ego, and who chooses a love that feels like safety, not survival. Stay with that. Hold that truth. And if you're ready, let your peace be your next chapter.